Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Niels Poulsen, who's a lecturer at the Center for American Studies at the Institute for History at the Syddansk University. He's from Denmark, and we'll be discussing an issue that's been a little bit hot these days, despite the cold weather involved, which is Greenland, and whether or not U.S. could, or would take it over, and if so, what that could look like. The reality is, of course, is that there is quite a bit of history behind the agreement that has allowed U.S. Access to Greenland in the first place. And there's a curious background to all of this that many people don't necessarily know about. So I'm actually curious to start with. Let's talk about the background of this current crisis, diplomatic crisis for now. How did the U.S.-Denmark defense relationship over Greenland originally take shape, and what strategic assumptions drove it during the early Cold War?
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I think I'll say for a start that there is really no background to the current crisis other than President Trump's strong desire to own Greenland and annex Greenland. And that goes back to 2019. But let's start with the current military relationship. Mm-hmm. During World War II, we can go even further back and look at previous examples of the U.S. wanting to buy Greenland. But perhaps we should go back to 1916 when the U.S. bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark. It became part of the treaty that the American Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, in the treaty agreed that Denmark had complete sovereignty over Greenland. At that time, there was a dispute between Norway and Denmark, interestingly, about partial ownership of Greenland. And the U.S. sort of sided with Denmark and said, we will buy the Virgin Islands, and in return, we will give you America's guarantee that Denmark has sovereignty over Greenland. So let's jump to the outbreak of World War II and the German occupation of Denmark. We had an ambassador in the U.S., Kaufman, who did something on his own. He said, regardless of the fact that that Denmark is occupied, and regardless of what the Danish government believes in, I, by request from the King of Denmark, will actually give the United States access to Greenland during the war. And it's important to realize why. There was an American interest in Greenland for the very fact that you couldn't fly airplanes, supplies, all the stuff you needed to send to Great Britain under the various attempts to help Great Britain before the United States was in the war. You couldn't fly all the way to Europe in one stretch. So the U.S. had an interest in building a landing strip in Greenland so they could make a stop on their way to Europe. In reverse, you could say Greenland was sort of cut off from Denmark during the occupation, and Greenland needed help from the United States. And President Franklin Roosevelt then sort of realized that if you had a landing strip in Greenland, that also meant that Nazi Germany could fly the other way and actually use that landing strip to attack the United States. So what happened was that you had a number of American military bases in Greenland during World War II. And as I said, Greenland was sort of cut off from Denmark in those years. Then we get to 1946, after the war. The Danish foreign minister is in the US, and the Truman administration actually offered to buy Greenland for $100 million, and that was clearly rejected. At the time, there was no interest, and Greenland was not for sale. But of course, Greenland still had ties to the United States in the shape of military camps. Then we get to 1949 and the establishment of NATO. Denmark is among the first members of NATO. And in 1951, the US and Denmark makes a joint defense agreement about Greenland, which during the Cold War gave the United States access to all the bases they wanted to create in Greenland. It became sort of a joint obligation to defend Greenland. And at one point during the Cold War, the US had 17 military bases in Greenland. One of them, the Thule Air Base, is now the only one left. It's now Pitufik Space Base. But they did have 17, and at the height of the Cold War, you could find more than 10,000 American soldiers in Greenland. And now, today, there are about 150.
Now,
So, yeah, so I mean, the US has had a right to build as many bases as they wanted to. Greenland is NATO territory. That has not been an issue at all. If there was a division of labor, the US would be on the ground and on the Thule Air Base with radar stations that monitor missiles flying over the North Pole and so on. And at the same time, Denmark has the advanced ships in inspection ships around the waters of Greenland. So that has worked. And then at a certain point after the end of the Cold War, the US actually decided that the Arctic was supposed to be a low tension area, and they shut down almost all of the military bases they had, with the exception of that one Pitufik Space Base. So that has been the situation. It has been sort of a very amiable relationship. There was one major crisis in 1968 when a nuclear, a B-52 with 4 nuclear bombs actually crashed in Greenland, and one of the nuclear bombs got lost in the ice, and it took a major recovery effort to get that nuclear bomb up. If perhaps I should mention one thing more. In the late 50s, early 1960s, there were very elaborate plans. The US actually built an underground city in Greenland. It was known as Camp Century. It was about 100 feet below the ice, and they brought a nuclear reactor up there to warm up and to provide energy to the entire underground city. And it was part of an effort to create a missile system with hundreds of kilometers of various, how can I put this, various places where the mid-range missiles could actually move around under the ice, so the enemy would not know exactly where the nuclear arsenal was. That was the intention. However, as it turned out, the ice was working more than anticipated, and it was sort of caving in. And in the end, this project, known as Project or Operation ice worm turned out to be not feasible. But this is all just to say that there has been a lot of military cooperation during the years, and it hasn't been because the Americans couldn't do whatever they wanted to do in terms of stationing soldiers and building military camps, and they still can. So, which brings me to 2019, if I may just continue.
Mm-hmm.
So, in 2019, President Trump was sort of supposedly informed by a good friend, Ron Lauder, that there were all sorts of opportunities in Greenland, that it would be a great real estate deal because you had around 57,000 inhabitants in Greenland, and it was the world's largest island. And Trump became sort of apparently obsessed with the idea that he could actually get that island and make it part of the United States and add this giant territory, which is 2 or 3 times the size of Texas, add that to the United States. And as it turned out, he made the request to the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, asked her if he could buy the territory. And he was told that Greenland belonged to the Greenlanders. I should perhaps add that since 1979, Greenland has had first home rule, and since 2009, what is known as self-government. That is, Greenland is independent in most areas except for foreign relations and defense. And they have taken back most other areas and can do so when they wish to and when they feel ready to do it. But in education, hospitals, all sorts of other things are provided or sponsored by Denmark. And of course, people from Greenland are Danish citizens as well. And that sort of complicates things again. You cannot sell people that are part of your country. So nevertheless, Trump asked for it and was told that the idea was absurd, which upset him, and he canceled an official visit to Denmark in 2019 because he thought that the way it had been said to him was rude, and so he didn't want to come to Denmark. And that was sort of the end of the story back then, until Trump was reelected. And in the Christmas of 2024, about 2 months after he was reelected, he revived the idea of buying Greenland and demanding that Greenland should be part of the United States. And here we are. That has been sort of, it was clear that the idea had not gone, and it had almost become an obsession with him, and that's what he's pursuing now, the idea that somehow he can force his NATO partners in Europe to put pressure on Denmark to sell him Greenland.
Now, the natural question here is Trump's reasoning about purchasing Greenland or acquiring it in some way has changed over time. At various points, it was about critical minerals. Now it's about national security and Arctic routes. Given this complexity, why hasn't the U.S. Essentially increased its military presence and took advantage of its ability to do so over time? If this territory is so critical to U.S. national security concern, why has the U.S. reduced and not reintroduced new bases to Greenland?
That is, as they say, a very good question, probably because it's not about national security at all. It is about this idea of adding territory to the United States, because there's nothing that the U.S. couldn't do under the current circumstances if they wanted to. The same really with the critical minerals. American companies can apply for mining concessions the same way as everybody else can. Actually, the people who cannot apply for mining concessions would be the Chinese. There have been
Hmm.
the Danish government has had an agreement with the U.S. about not giving concessions on building harbors and other
Hmm.
kinds of construction to the Chinese. That has been they have sort of been kept out of Greenland, unlike Venezuela and other places where you've had Chinese investments, but not in Greenland. And American companies can apply. The thing is, it's very, very difficult to. One thing is to know that there are all these minerals. Many of the minerals, by the way, you can find in Alaska and elsewhere. It's not as if these are unique to Greenland necessarily. So there would be plenty of opportunity to find many of the same minerals in Alaska. But you could apply for mining concessions. The only problem is, of course, that many of these minerals are under 2 kilometers of ice, first of all. So you have to get through 2 kilometers of ice. And then there are no roads in Greenland. There are simply no roads. There are roads in the capital of Nuuk and a few roads here and there, but there are no major roads in Greenland, which means that you would have to create infrastructure and create giant infrastructure projects that would probably take 10 years in order to get actually to do mining that would be profitable. And even worse, what about the critical minerals? Once you get them out there, where do you want to process them? Actually, the only place, as far as I know, where you could process them is in China.
Hmm.
So it's not as if you can take them out. You would have to build processing plants for critical minerals, something that the United States doesn't have at the
Hmm.
moment. Even critical minerals coming from Colorado and elsewhere, there's no place to process them, if I'm correct. So there are all sorts of reasons why, when it actually mattered, very few American companies have been interested in doing the
Hmm.
kind of mining in Greenland, simply because it's not profitable. So you could do that without having to own Greenland. You could do all the military installations you would like without having to own Greenland. Actually, there's no sort of rational argument for owning Greenland other than to pay what Danish companies or the Danish government is now paying. The American taxpayers would have to pay that. And would they be willing to do that if you consider some of the other kinds of association that the U.S. has with Micronesia, for example, or the Marshall Islands? Denmark pays about 6 times as much per capita to people in Greenland as the U.S. pays to others, where they have these kinds of free associations. So it's very difficult to see any upside for the United States in actually owning Greenland, despite the fact that you would have a hostile population that is now. There's very little support in Greenland for actually joining the United States. I mean, 5-6% in opinion polls. So that makes it kind of difficult to see to view the whole issue other than sort of a personal obsession for President Trump.
Now, I have heard in recent news that there was an American company who signed an agreement with a Saudi refinery to refine the minerals that would be eventually mined out of Greenland. But it's strange to me that that company, that refinery, is not already involved with the Americans in refining existing critical minerals that US already has or that it has been buying from other countries. the whole setup seems very very odd to conclude these agreements long before there is any legal access to these minerals or any agreement to mine. Or as far as I know, that company is not currently operating. So I'm not sure whether that agreement is merely a news to kind of put psychological pressure or what the story is, but that's just something that I heard happened recently.
You've
Uh,
had, yeah,
mhm.
I'll go on.
No,
I
no,
mean,
that's it.
you can hear other stories about potential interest in Greenland. One
Mhm,
of them will be from some of the investors who are sometimes called the PayPal mafia,
mhm,
people, investors around Peter Thiel and
mhm,
some of the people who were involved in PayPal. Um, Quite a number of them have invested in various mining uh,
mhm,
companies in Greenland. And there's nothing wrong with that. They have been obviously they have been controlled, and I think the authorities in Greenland have sort of greenlighted their investments. You hear stories about ideas about how to the possibility of setting up sort of a free state somewhere in Greenland, just as there are attempts to set up utopian tax-free free states elsewhere. That there's an interest in that Greenland could provide something space for that. You also hear ideas about hydraulic, the fact that it's cold, that
mhm,
you could place you know computer equipment for AI, for example, in Greenland. But
mhm.
still, that would be a problem when there's no infrastructure really. That would also take enormous investments. So I think when you take out all the rational arguments for what Trump is doing at the moment, which is pushing NATO to its worst crisis, probably, then all the rational arguments about mining, about
Mm.
minerals, about defense, about national security, all of that sort of falls on the wayside, and you
Mm.
really come down to more of a personal obsession than anything else.
My understanding is that a number of other US presidents have tried to purchase or acquire Greenland at various points in time. How have those efforts been similar to or different from President Trump's?
Well, the first effort is probably all the way back in the 1860s, where William Henry Seward, who was the Secretary of State for Abraham Lincoln, um, Seward wanted to create what he would call like a commercial empire for the United States. And early on, he was very interested in uh, China, in Japan,
Mm.
and ways of getting to those markets. And this is like half a century before it really became an issue with the Spanish American War. But he was very interested. The thing that held him back was slavery. The fact that there was slavery and there was discussion in the 1850s about um, expansion and slavery, what that did, if you could actually bring your slaves to new territories. So as long as slavery was still an issue, he didn't want to push it. But around 1965, when he's negotiating with the Russians about buying Alaska, he begins to negotiate with the Danes about buying the Virgin Islands. And the idea was that, particularly the harbor in St. Thomas, one of the Virgin Islands, would have a very great harbor, which could be a coaling station. And he was also interested already in creating something like the Panama Canal, so you could get ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific. and sail to China without having to go all the way around Latin America or South America. So that was his vision. And in 1867, he bought Alaska from Russia and was still negotiating with Denmark about the Virgin Islands. And somebody said to him, while you're at it, while you're negotiating with the Danes, why don't you buy Greenland and Iceland as well? And he was asked, he actually he was asked if they could make a special report about all the advantages of Greenland and Iceland, and he commissioned that from the State Department. And there was a report which was not sort of on location, but everything they could find about Greenland and Iceland. It came back with recommendations to the State Department and to William Henry Seward about buying Greenland and Iceland and what you could get. One thing was to get a telegraph line all the way from the United States to Europe. And then they talked about the fishery and the mining, actually, the cryolite at the time, which is used and was used for aluminium. So that was one of the concerns. What happened, however, was that Lincoln had obviously died a couple of years before, been murdered, and Andrew Johnson was the president. And there was a major conflict between Andrew Johnson and the so-called radical Republicans in Congress over how to treat the former slaves in the South, whether they should have the right to vote, and so on. And Johnson was just vetoing everything, all these attempts to create civil rights in the South for the former slaves. And in return, Congress began to just vote down everything that was suggested by the Johnson administration. Eventually, they also impeached Johnson, but it already became a problem with paying for Alaska. You had people mocking the purchase of Alaska and saying, well, you know, it's Seward's folly, it's Seward's icebox. What are we going to do with Alaska? What's the purpose of that? And then there was a congressman from Wisconsin who discovered that Seward was also thinking about Greenland and Iceland, and actually said, not only are we buying one icebox, but now he's also in the process of buying another icebox, and he's in the process of buying the Virgin Islands, and there had just been a tsunami in the Virgin Islands the year before, in 1867, I believe. So he was asking rhetorically, should the American taxpayers really pay for tsunamis and iceboxes and so on? It doesn't make any sense. And despite the fact that Seward had an idea about strategically, you could have Alaska on the Pacific side, and you could have Greenland on the Atlantic side. And then perhaps over time, you could sort of pressure Canada or parts of Canada, British Columbia, into becoming part of the United States, not unlike what Trump is talking about now. That was sort of part of the vision. But given the fact that there was such hostility to even the purchase of Alaska, Seward just gave up and said, there's no way we'll get the vote for the Virgin Islands. And or they didn't. And actually, it was back in the day when you could still buy territory. And Denmark was kind of disappointed because they had made a referendum in the Virgin Islands, and the majority of people wanted to become Americans, and therefore it was sort of embarrassing that suddenly it was voted down in Congress. So they actually started a pressure campaign to say, well, you've sort of promised you wanted to buy it. Long story short, they never came to discuss Greenland and Iceland. Iceland, by the way, was also part of Denmark back then. So it is unknown whether there was any willingness in Denmark to actually sell Greenland and Iceland, but there was an interest in the U.S. And that happened a couple of times later in the 1890s, in 1909 and 1910. And then, as I mentioned, finally in 1916, when the agreement was made to sell the Virgin Islands, it was also confirmed by America that Greenland belonged to Denmark. Now you hear President Trump say, well, nobody knows if they even own the place or have any right to it. It's something with a boat they came with 500 years ago, and we have a boat as well. But it's there on paper that there's a treaty where the U.S. acknowledges that Greenland belongs to Denmark, or at least did back then when it was a colony. Now it's a different matter. Now it belongs to the people of Greenland.
Now, since then, have there been any other interim efforts to acquire Greenland by the U.S. between Seward and Trump?
No, there was, as I said, it came up in negotiations in 1909 and 10. There was a fantastic proposal by the American ambassador in Copenhagen. Denmark had lost the southern part of the country to Germany in 1864. And then with the Spanish-American War in 1898, of course, the U.S., among other possessions, suddenly was in charge of the Philippines. And his proposal was, well, the Germans would like the Philippines or some of the islands. Why don't we make a swap? So we will swap the Virgin Islands and perhaps Greenland for 2 islands in the Philippines. And then the Danes can swap the Philippines with the southern part of the country, southern Jutland, and get that back. Nothing came of it, but that was sort of an attempt. The thing is, after 1917 and the U.S. possession of the Virgin Islands, the idea of selling land, the idea of selling peoples have sort of died out. And suddenly, a century later, Trump is attempting to revive it, the idea that you can actually sell people. He actually, I know in 2019, where he talked about getting Greenland, he said to some of his advisors whether perhaps he could make a swap with Puerto Rico, so Denmark could get Puerto Rico and he could get Greenland. And they naturally sort of called off the idea as fairly absurd.
That does strike me as at least geographically implausible, linguistically complicated, and also Puerto Rico or Greenland were not really consulted in this matter, it seems.
No, and that's you know when he's on his way, I guess, to Davos now for the economic summit, and is apparently determined to say, I will put pressure on all the NATO countries that are now doing military exercise in Greenland, the Scandinavian countries, but also Germany and France and the UK, until they let me buy Greenland. But none of them can you can put all the pressure you want. It's not as if they can say, okay, you can buy it, because it's not theirs to sell, and it's not Denmark's to sell either.
Now, we're focusing on the Virgin Islands for a second. Back in the day, it was known as the Danish West Indies, but clearly, both the political and the legal conditions for making that transactions were quite different from the situation we're discussing today. So, what was it about those times that made such a uh, such an exchange or possible, such an agreement possible?
Well, you could say Denmark. There was actually slavery in the West Indies until 1848. That was when Denmark ended slavery in the Virgin Islands, and that also meant that, I guess, from the Danish government, it was less profitable. And at the same time, we had lost the war to Germany, and there was a need for funding. So even though the first time William Henry Seward sort of suggested to the Danish ambassador that the US would like to buy the Virgin Islands, he sort of rejected it. Well, we've all already just lost a lot of territory. We are not going to lose anymore. But then he sort of got interested and said, by the way, if you wanted to buy it, how much would you be willing to pay? So it was not as unusual in the 19th century to buy territory or to sell territory. But obviously, in this day and age, it's not something you talk about, I guess, unless you're Donald Trump, and the arguments he's using now are arguments that could be applied by Russia to Ukraine or by other major powers, China to Taiwan, or whatever. The idea that, well, we need it for security, and we can only sort of make it safe if we own it. Now, that's not really an argument for anything, but then I guess you would have to own all the land, all the places where you had strategic interests. And it makes even less sense in Greenland because the US can already do whatever they want to do in terms of national security. Uh, but I mean, it's not really an argument at all.
Hmm.
And Trump gave this long interview a couple of weeks ago to the New York Times and said that it was kind of a psychological need for him, the feeling that it was sort of better to own than to, and you
Hmm.
would really defend something if you owned it. The other part of it is, of course, his claims about Russian and Chinese activities around Greenland. And that's simply purely made up for the occasion. I mean, in terms of there are probably Russian submarines, but that's not the close. That's not really where they are, and they are being monitored right now. And as for Chinese ships, which Trump claimed that you could see them with your own eyes, there hasn't been a Chinese ship in those waters for the last 9, 10 years, actually.
Hmm.
So it's a completely made up threat. And
Hmm.
even if it were more of a threat in terms of new types of missiles flying over Greenland and so on, it's not something that you can't monitor at the moment with the radar installations you have, or you could expand them if you wanted to. So that's not really an argument either.
So, a few analysts here and there have been pointing to China's so-called Polar Silk Road project, which is basically an idea of circumventing of the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, by going around the Arctic and expanding the Belt and Road Initiative into the nearby areas in order to essentially control supply chain access by physical dominance of those routes. To what extent is U.S. rhetoric about the alleged threat coming from Chinese presence near Greenland aligns with the U.S. and other Western countries' efforts to essentially block militarization of the Arctic by Russia and China?
See, that's where we get into an area that I don't know that much about when it comes to the actual
Hmm.
initiative. all I can say is that it's a common understanding that it's quite well monitored at the moment. And there's, of course, the interesting paradox you point to, that as you have climate change, uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there may be, or it's likely that there will be more traffic in those waters,
Mm-hmm.
simply for the fact that it will be accessible for a more for a longer time every year, and will be an alternative to other shipping routes. I think that's a fact. The irony is, of course, that Donald Trump doesn't recognize climate change as something that is real. He claims that it's a Chinese hoax and that there is no climate change. And in a
Yes.
sense, this is based on, if there is a growing threat or potential threat, it will be due to climate change, and that is probably real, but it's still something that can be handled within the framework of the already existing agreements. And as I said, the military agreement, the joint defense agreement from 1951, was updated in 2004. So it's not as if there is a need for any further agreement within that existing agreement. You can probably do, or you can do, whatever you want to do in terms of defense considerations.
Some are arguing that Trump's fixation on this issue is not just some personal quirk, but part of a broader effort to revive the manifest destiny concept. Do you see it that way? Is he trying to apply the same logic to it, or is it also yet another layer of justifications for very personal interest?
Well, I think if you look at the National Defense Strategy, which came out,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, in the beginning of December, you clearly have that focus on the Western Hemisphere, and you get the sense that the US wants to be a regional power only in the Western Hemisphere, and it's all about keeping non regional powers out, mostly, I assume, China from Latin America and Russia. But you could say that agreement from 1916, there was a Monroe Doctrine at the time as well, and generally it was seen as, Greenland was not within the understanding at the time of what the Monroe Doctrine covered. That was not an issue. It wasn't as if we give you an exception to the Monroe Doctrine. And also now, at least in the Danish debate, you can hear people refer to the Monroe Doctrine as one specific thing that, well, it's a long established tradition in American foreign relations, the Monroe Doctrine. But the Monroe Doctrine has been many different things over the years. And the original Monroe Doctrine from 1823 was mostly sort of an anti colonial document. It was actually suggested by the British government, by George Canning, who suggested to the Americans, why don't we make a statement that we will oppose any additional colonization in the Western Hemisphere, that is in Central and Latin America. That was what they were concerned with. And mostly they were concerned with Spain, I guess, and some other European powers, the so-called Holy Alliance with Russia and Austria and so on. So that was the original idea. And then in 1904, you get the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he uses the word that the US should function as an international police force. I think that's the word he's using. But when you look at what he's actually describing, there was a context which was a debt crisis in Venezuela in 1902, 1903. And he's really saying, Theodore Roosevelt, that is, he's really saying, um, we are now a major power and we should take the responsibility. There's an international system, and rather than have the creditors from Italy and Germany and Britain intervene in Venezuela to get their money, we should be the police force in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, he's sort of recognizing that there is an international system, and in order for it to work, then the US has to be part of that system. And his political rival, Woodrow Wilson, who later becomes president, also talks about the Monroe Doctrine. But he talks about the Monroe Doctrine, expanding it to all of the world. That is, we need to create a system where no big power can sort of colonize a major power, which is sort of the exact opposite of what Trump is now suggesting with Greenland when he says we need Greenland and we can take it. Nobody is going to oppose us. That's what his advisor, Stephen Miller, is saying. You know, who wants to challenge the United States? If we want to take Greenland, we will take it. And he's, of course, confronted with the fact that this is NATO territory, which ironically means that due to Article 5 in the NATO agreement, the so-called Musketeer Oath, if Greenland is attacked, the United States has a responsibility to defend it. So, if you apply that logic, you would be able to see America both attacking Greenland and defending it against an attack from the United States, which makes it kind of absurd to even talk about not ruling out using military force in Greenland.
So is Miller saying here that basically Article 5 either will not apply or that the Europeans who so far have had very muted response to, for instance, Russian drones and other provocations, are not going to will not have the capacity to do anything, even if they, intellectually they're opposed to it?
So the problem is that he's actually saying that, well, even if we have that kind of Article 5 responsibilities, we don't really care. If we want Greenland, we can take it. Now, I don't know if Stephen Miller is sort of responsible, if this is the official position of the American government, but that's what he's saying. Might gives right, I guess that's what he's saying, which is completely opposed, of course, to the very idea of the NATO alliance. And that's why you could see this past weekend, you had 10 American politicians, senators, and Congress members from both political parties in Copenhagen attempting to reassure the Danish government and the Danish people, hold on, we still have some checks and balances in the system, and we will attempt to prevent anything from happening. And they were basically there at their own initiative, I think, to reassure Denmark that there was that they didn't think, that there would be any actual military threat from the Trump administration. You have a number of proposals in Congress right now that would supposedly make it impossible for Trump to fund any kind of military adventure in Greenland. Congress still has the power of the purse. They would still be able to say, we make a law that will specifically say that you cannot spend $1 on any kind of military expedition to Greenland if the purpose is to annex the territory. I think there are 2 or 3 proposals working their way through the House right now for that purpose. It was sort of the same thing that you could see under the Obama administration when Obama talked about moving prisoners from Guantanamo to the
Mm-hmm.
American mainland. Congress passed a law saying you cannot spend a single dollar on this, which made it impossible to make that shift. And so that's one thing you could do with the power of the purse in order to prevent it. And if the Trump administration then went ahead anyway with a threat of some kind, it would be sort of just a very clear violation of law passed by Congress.
So, what would you say are the risks of U.S. framing Greenland primarily as a strategic asset rather than a political community and kind of ignoring these sovereignty issues? There's some discussion that Russia and China might use this as an excuse to it basically benefits them by saying, well, US is doing exactly what we are doing, so they cannot criticize us for going after Ukraine, Taiwan, and so forth.
Yeah, that's clearly the other danger, right? It's sending a clear signal to both to Russia and China, I guess, saying, uh, we are simply applying the same kind of logic to Ukraine than that America is applying to Greenland, and it doesn't have anything to do with the size of the population or the size of the landmass. It's just a fact that we feel more secure if we own this. So I mean, in addition to what it's doing to the NATO alliance, in addition to what it's doing to the
Mm-hmm.
people of Greenland that have to live with this threat that the president of the United States, the strongest military force in the world, is threatening to invade them, or at least not ruling out the possibility of invading them. In addition to all of that, it's also sending a signal to other great powers, then go ahead, do what you want to do in your part of the world, just as we're doing what we want to do in our part of the world. And that's, I think, very, very harmful to the international system. It's simply saying there are no rules, there are no laws. If you can do it,
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and do it, and nobody can prevent us from doing this. And ultimately, you will have to accept that that is how things are going to go. And I think you will experience that Trump will experience I hope he will experience a very hard pushback in Davos to that kind of logic for all those reasons, not just for the sake of Greenland, but also for the sake of the NATO alliance and for the sake of the whole idea, the whole concept of international order.
Now, I'd like to push back on this a little bit, not because I have any agreement with Trump on the matter, but because I do think that there's been some level of inconsistency when it comes to the alignment of
Oh,
interests.
sorry, can we just? I think I'm running out of power. I just need to
Sure,
actually
sure.
hook it up. Just a
Mhm.
second. And by the way, Irina, I probably have to go in 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly when we'll wrap up. Um,
Okay.
so, so, I wanted to push back a little bit on what you said, not because I have any agreement with Trump, but because I see a little bit of an inconsistency between the way European Union perceives their interests versus the broader context of Trump's actions and comments in his second term in particular. Namely, I'd like to draw attention to the fact of what happened in Syria after Assad's ouster. Trump essentially, in the beginning of his second term, basically said that Turkey is the main actor in Syria from now on, and that essentially, you know, Erdogan came and took what he wanted, in terms of power and so forth, that US is not going to oppose it. Now, the European Union not only did not really make much of those comments, but they actually followed the US in their policy on Syria. We're seeing today a great deal of upheaval there, with ISIS prisoners being released, with SDF, which has been both, the Western partner on counterterrorism in Syria, being pressured to abandon the cities and essentially abandon their autonomy. So it seems to me that the same logic that was, that Trump is applying to Europe, he's also applied to the Middle East, Latin America, other parts of the world. But the collective outrage has only been awakened when it comes to the internal security and sovereignty interests being being essentially touched, and not when it comes to other places that are less manageable. So how can we reconcile this inconsistency in the European Union attitude, given that they're trying to call out Trump exactly for that sort of thing?
I I simply don't know enough about the situation in Syria. I think, though, that so there might be double standards.
Mm-hmm,
I wouldn't know about that, but I think what makes a difference
mm-hmm,
here is that you're talking about NATO territory. So
mm-hmm,
you're talking about one NATO country attacking another NATO, not
mm-hmm,
potentially, or not ruling out attacking another NATO country. And I think there is a sense that NATO has been a very successful alliance, and that it is now in jeopardy due to this idea that it has never been conceived of that a NATO country, well, it has in a sense, you had a conflict between Turkey and Greece at some
mm-hmm,
point, two NATO countries. But I think even though you can find that example, you would still have a sense that this is the logic behind what Trump is
mm-hmm,
saying. Looks like a deliberate attempt to destroy NATO by
mm-hmm.
removing the basic principle of NATO, which is Article 5. And I think that's why you have a stronger objection. I would say, I hope you have a stronger objection, but because it's not as if you haven't had any trouble, any problems within the NATO alliance. For example, in relation to Ukraine,
Mhm,
it has been very difficult to uh, get to motivate some of the southern European countries, Spain,
mhm,
Portugal, and so on, to really be engaged there. And again, in this current situation, we're also mostly talking, I guess, about Northern European NATO members, the Scandinavian countries, France, Britain, Germany, and so on. But I still think that if it became even more of a threat to Greenland, I hope that the entire NATO alliance would actually react. And we have seen so far Mark Rutte, the what's the title, General Director of
mhm,
General Secretary of NATO, has been very reluctant to really confront Trump's statements at this point, and is still very conciliatory and say, let's talk this out and so on.
mhm,
And you have rumblings within the alliance. Is this really do you want to be that conciliatory? Doesn't it just confirm
mhm,
Trump's idea about Europeans being weak and not having a spine? So I think that we will see that within the next couple of days, whether Europe is really gearing up for a much more firm response to Trump's statements. You saw perhaps yesterday he circulated a letter he had sent to the government of Norway, which basically said, well, your country didn't give me the Nobel Peace Prize, so now I'm not sure I want to be that peaceful anymore, which was kind of an odd statement, let's just say that. And sort of an implied threat,
Mm-hmm.
you and the other countries defending Greenland, we will impose 10% additional tariffs on you. And if you still haven't given me Greenland, once we get to June, it will be 25% and so on. I mean, a lot of stuff might happen in the following weeks. There's also a Supreme Court decision coming down um, on the tariffs and the use of tariffs, or to what extent the president even has the right to use these use tariffs as a punishment for things that have nothing to do with
Mm-hmm.
economic policy. So, I mean, a lot of things can change in the near future, but I think even immediately in Davos, it will be interesting to see what the responses are like.
Now, to finish up with the final question, I'm seeing that at least part of Trump's logic is inspired precisely by the fact that Article 5 was not actually invoked against Russian and increasingly Chinese threats inside Western countries. Do you think, and the fact that some countries, on an individual basis, even opposed collective NATO action in certain circumstances altogether? I cannot imagine that he does not interpret this as a green light to challenge this logic further, if not through military means, then but at least pushing the envelope as much as possible. To what extent do you think Article 5 today, in today's political climate, would actually be applicable as opposed to lead to lack of consensus and coalitions of the willing responding to various military crises, should they be deemed an actual crisis and not some sort of a minor provocation?
Well, I think some will say the difference is that Ukraine is not currently a NATO member, and thus,
No, but Russia attacked a number of NATO member states aside from, leaving
oh
Ukraine
yeah,
conflicted sites in the
yeah, yeah.
past year alone.
I mean, you've
None of
had
that has
clearly
led
you've
to
had
a
yeah.
full Article 5 invocation. There's been several partners who scrambled to help, but there hasn't been a formal collective NATO response on an Article 5 basis. And this is what I think this is the sort of ambiguity that Trump is exploiting. Yes, of course, there are NATO members who will go and help immediately if something happens. But what about NATO as a structure, as an organization? Is
Yeah.
there enough consensus for everybody to agree unanimously on anything?
I, I have to say I don't know enough about that.
Mm-hmm.
I have a very good colleague in the political science department who has written 3 books now on NATO, and he would probably be able to give you a satisfying answer to the degree of coherence within the alliance,
Mm-hmm.
and what extent it's fraying over this. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think, unfortunately, it's sort of above my pay grade to
Mm-hmm.
make that assessment.
Well, I certainly hope that this issue ends up simmering out either because Trump gets distracted by someone else or because European Union and other, NATO members essentially put up sufficiently clear response that it just isn't worth anyone's while on the US to push any further right now. I think Trump senses a potential opening and he's testing the response. It's very
Yeah,
clear
yeah.
clear to
And,
me.
but I think he is. I think he's overestimating both the weakness of his own NATO partners, and I think also you see growing resistance in both political parties in Congress, actually.
Hmm.
The problem, the question is whether that will happen soon enough, but I think that is still a clear majority of Republicans in Congress who have great affinity for NATO and thinks
Mm-hmm.
that this is an important alliance and view America's alliances differently from how Trump viewed them. And I think I hope we might see that in the next couple of weeks.
I certainly hope so as well. Thank you so much for this insightful discussion, and I think understanding the history is very important to understanding the frameworks in which we're currently operating and why certain things make or do not make sense. And of course, understanding that a lot of the time it's not about the selling points that are being given, it's very much about completely different motivations and agendas, and things should be judged for what they are and not what certain people want us to believe they are. So I hope this clarifies a lot and gives this sort of broader perspective to everyone wondering what is going on with the place the most Americans have not heard of up until recently. Um, for
So
for those joining us, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. on the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you so much.
thank you.